What I want to talk about today is two things that developed as a consequence of the French Revolution, Napoleon, the Enlightenment, etc., etc. Everything changed after the French Revolution and Napoleon. Realistically, everything changed after the American Revolution. You had all these ideas that were circulating during the Enlightenment, and then all of a sudden, somebody tried to put these ideas into practice. In America, government for and by the people, a Declaration of Independence, a Constitution, a Bill of Rights. All of this was based on the ideas of the Enlightenment. Then the French Revolution erupted. The people rise up, they kill their king, they try to forcefully spread revolutionary ideas. There's a reaction against this forceful expansion of French revolutionary ideas. But everything has now changed. After 1815, after Napoleon is defeated, the idea that people deserve a government of their own choosing that represents their specific interests and is not simply a king that inherits his territory cannot be ignored. And especially for the middle classes in the rest of Europe who don't have the vote, they are living in an absolute monarchy. They can no longer accept their position as educated, wealthy, but politically powerless people. The French rose up against that system of government. Others wanted to mimic it. Maybe not as violently, but they wanted the same thing. The same thing with, and that's the spread of this, liberalism. Self-government, equality, a government for and of the people. But the other consequence of the French Revolution is the spread of this, nationalism. When the government of France canceled all privileges and said there is no more first estate, second estate, third estate. Everybody born in France is a citizen of France. End of story. And with that comes certain rights and privileges. There is equality of citizenship. You are now members of the French nation. You are no longer subjects of King Louis XVI. You are members of the French nation, the people of France. You choose your own government. Okay. This idea that everybody in France was invested in the future of France, that they were part of an active nation defending itself, was born of the French Revolution, when French men and women were defending themselves against foreign attack. Ironically, when the French invaded the rest of Europe, those people got a sense of their identity in defending themselves and pushing back the French. So when France invaded Prussia, all divisions between rich and poor disappeared. All Prussians bound together to push out the French. When the French invaded Russia, all divisions between rich and poor Russians, nobles and commoners, disappeared. Because they were all fighting against France. You have this birth of nationalism which takes place, and all of this is a consequence of the French Revolution, along with liberalism. Let me see. Now, nationalism is easy. Everyone knows what that is. This binding based on common language, territory, government, common goals, etc. But for the purposes of this class, what does liberalism mean? As defined by the Enlightenment, the English Bill of Rights, the American Revolution, etc., etc. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the spread of liberalism that was accelerated because of the French Revolution begins with legal equality. Everybody who's a citizen has the same rights and obligations regardless of wealth. Religious toleration. The state is no longer in the business of punishing people because they don't follow one particular religion. All of this is a consequence of the Enlightenment. Free press. More and more there is a belief that if you want government to represent the interests of the people, the press has to be allowed to publish anything that it wants, as long as it's true. The press should be allowed to publish whatever it wants about society, government, whatever. A limited and representative government. What does that mean? The people have a right to elect their own government, a national assembly, a chamber of deputies, an English parliament, whatever it is, the people have a right to elect their own government. But most importantly, liberalism in the 19th century believed government must be limited. It should not make any more laws than are absolutely necessary. Because you have to remember, liberalism in the 19th century was reacting against absolute monarchy, where the king could do whatever he wanted. The liberal governments of the 19th century, they hoped for a government that did nothing more than protect your rights, regulate trade as lightly as possible, and maintain a decent standard of living. Okay? Now, free trade was the last one. Limited interference in the economy. This is what all governments aimed for in the 19th century, first in Europe, but also increasingly in America. So I want to talk very quickly about the different types of ways that liberalism and nationalism were put into place, some well, some not so well, and then I want to take us into the American Civil War, where you had the situation where everyone knows what the American nation is, but there's one thing that divides Americans, the issue of slavery. And that's when it gets confusing, because slavery in the eyes of the South is property, and liberal governments protect property. But slavery in the eyes of the North is immoral, because these are people, and you are denying them equality. This is where it gets a little tricky. What is the role of government? Protecting equality and protecting property, but what happens when property are human beings? And thus the American Civil War. So let me very quickly go through the French and the British, how they tried to make sense of the French Revolution and its ideas in the modern era, successes and failures, and then shoot into the American version. Now, in France, in the first few years after Napoleon is conquered, they try to expand the role of government in a more liberal fashion, respecting the needs of the people, but they did it in fits and starts, and there was always violence, because they could never figure out a way to satisfy the poor, satisfy the middle classes that now run the government, getting rid of the old monarchy. They just couldn't figure it out. So there was a series of revolutions that France went through before they finally calmed down and just became a democracy without a king. In 1815, France was given back a king, King Louis XVIII. He was brought back, and he was brought back as a constitutional monarch. This guy had no beliefs that he was an absolute king. He had seen the French Revolution. He had seen his grandfather executed. He recognized France had changed. He was going to be a constitutional monarch. He was going to recognize that the National Assembly, the French government elected by the French people, was his partner. And he was on the throne for 9 years until 1824 successfully, because he recognized the middle classes are in power, there is a constitution, there is no more absolutism in France. And everybody was happy with that. He died. His brother takes the throne as Charles X in 1824. Charles X was one of history's greatest fools, because he simply did not understand that the world had changed. Charles X attempted to become an absolute monarch. He attempted to ignore the National Assembly. He attempted to shut down freedom of the press. He attempted to give lands back to the people that had lost land during the French Revolution. Nobles, clergy, etc. The result of all this, in 1830, the French people rose up against his government, and he was thrown out. there was a union of the very poor and the middle classes who each felt they were losing out in this new government, losing political rights, civil rights, whatever the case may be. So Charles X was kicked out in 1830. That's the Revolution of 1830. No different than the Revolution of 1789, where the common people rise up and overthrow their absolutist king. The next guy on the throne is named Louis Philippe. And you'll notice he's not King Louis Philippe. You'll notice that he's not Louis the First or the Second or anything. He purposely took a common name. And he was on the throne for 18 years. Why? Because he finally, unlike his predecessor, made peace with the fact that France was different. The king was no longer an absolute monarch. The bourgeoisie had real power in the National Assembly, and they were not going to give it up. There was an expectation of checks and balances, constitutional monarchy, and this guy was known as the bourgeois king. He was most agreeable to the French middle classes because he respected their political rights, and most importantly, their property would be protected under his government. It would not be taken away, given to some nobles or some church. Now, he made sure the press was free. He made sure that the chamber, the National Assembly, the actual the body that represented the French people, was respected. He didn't interfere with their functions at all. And he also extended the franchise or the vote. He lowered the property limit so more people could vote. So these were all parts of the expansion of liberalism in France in the early 19th century. It was done violently and in fits and starts, but it did happen. The problem was Louis Philippe, as an ally of the middle classes, had no interest in the poor, which means government programs for the unemployed, for working class housing, they didn't receive any real funding. So the poor continued to suffer. And throughout history, if you tell poor people you have political rights, you have civil rights, you have free press, you have freedom of religion, they're always going to tell you the same thing. It doesn't matter if I'm starving. If I have the freedom to write whatever I want and read whatever newspaper I want and vote however I want, but I'm starving because the government doesn't support programs for poor people, then what does it matter? This is an idea of the difference in leadership styles. Charles X on the left, as you could see, he dressed and presented himself like the old-fashioned absolute monarch, the guy that I started this class with, Louis XIV. He purposely dressed himself as above and more special than everyone else. Louis Philippe purposely dressed himself in a very regular, recognizable, and common fashion. Obviously, he's not dressed like a poor person, but in this sort of military formal uniform, it was recognizable that he was not pretending to be an elite absolutist monarch, but a monarch as recognizable by the French bourgeoisie, who had the power now in France. In Britain, there was far less violence, but there was an expansion of liberal ideas slowly but surely. All the violence in Britain came from the very beginning. The war against Napoleon and France is over in 1815. What generally happens after a war is you have a depression, because all the industries that were working full speed during the war, providing armies with their guns and their food and their uniforms, now they get dialed back because the war is over. People are laid off. There's unemployment. There's a recession. Now, in response to this post-war unemployment, government recession, and the high price of food, there was a variety of public demonstrations in Britain demanding the government do something about the high cost of food. Now, one of the biggest demonstrations took place in Manchester, unless I'm getting it wrong, at St. Peter's Square and it was named the Peterloo Massacre, where regular people, poor people, middle-class people peacefully demonstrated for help against the high cost of food from their government. The government felt that any demonstration was the beginnings of another revolution like the one in France. They overreacted. They sent in the military against these defenseless people. And they also passed, the British government, the 6 Acts, which limited the publishing and the meeting of all people or pamphlets dealing with radical ideas. And radical meant anything that disagrees with the government. This was a significant limitation of liberal principles. And this is what it looked like. This picture, which attempted to capture the fact that it's a drawing, somebody drew this with an agenda to communicate ideas. It's not meant to be totally realistic, because obviously nobody looks like this. But the soldiers, what do you see in this picture? What do you see in this picture? Pick out anything. What do you see in this picture? Okay. By who? Soldiers. All right. Describe the soldiers to me. What do you see?
Angry.
All right.
Fat.
All right. Well, they're plump, which means what?
They're well fed.
They're well fed. Are there any fat people in the audience? So you see the difference here? Well-fed soldiers trampling on the rights of the hungry people. Are there any arms or weapons in the crowd?
No.
So well-fed armed soldiers are trampling on defenseless, starving civilians. Talk to me about the makeup of the crowd. What do you see?
Women, children.
Stop talking.
Sorry.
You're very excited. But other people are going to jump in. What do you see down here? What do you see? Death. But tell me about the participants. Who are represented here? Give me specifics. What do you see? Women? What else?
Children.
Some children.
A big woman with a baby.
Woman with a baby. Elderly man holding a cane. Right? All of these things are meant to depict, these are regular people making simple demands peacefully, and they're being overrun by well-fed, well-armed, and merciless representatives of the government. This cartoon, do you think it was drawn by a supporter of the government or an enemy of the government? An enemy. Because the goal of this cartoon was to highlight the brutal behavior of the government and to publish this in newspapers across the country. Slowly but surely, the British government came to the realization that you cannot crush all demands for reform. You have to give in slowly, otherwise the people will rise up, like at the Peterloo Massacre, but maybe next time the government won't be able to shut them down. So instead of having that, and instead of having all the chaos that France is going through with one revolution after another, slowly extend liberal principles to give more people the right to vote, to slowly extend people's rights in response to the needs of the people, so that you can bring the people into the nation and make them support the government and not treat the government as their enemy. So, for instance, the first group that they reached out to, the British government, was Ireland. Ireland had, a neighboring island, had been conquered years ago by the British, and the Irish people had been treated as second and third class citizens for a variety of reasons. A, they were colonized, so they were exploited, but B, they were Catholic. And England was an officially Protestant nation. So Catholics were viewed as not very well. I'll just leave it at that. But the people of Ireland, the Irish, in spite of their colonized nature, there was a lot of them, and they weren't silently going to sit there and be taken for granted forever. They were demanding their say. They were demanding rights. In 1829, the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed, in order to calm down rising demands for Irish rights, or the rights of Irish men and women. After 1829, the Irish now had representation in the British Parliament. They were now slowly brought into what is now called the United Kingdom, so that they could no longer, the goal was, if you do not treat them totally as a conquered people, you give them the vote, they will peacefully move for reform within the government as opposed to against the government. This worked for about 100 years, but eventually the Irish wanted their country back, and they got it. As the years went by, the British government slowly expanded the reforms, and let me go through them rather quickly. In 1832, they expanded the right to vote. They lowered the property qualification and expanded the right to vote to about 200,000 people. This was incredibly important because the middle classes, the property holders of England that demanded the right to vote, and were not revolutionaries, they just wanted the right to vote because that's how they were taught from the Enlightenment. They had a right to vote. It was given to them. All of a sudden, 200,000 people are taken off the list of enemies of the government. They become supporters of the government. And as the years go by, another reform bill is passed in 1867, which further lowers the barrier against voting. Now, this is for men only. It lowers the barrier for voting. So now virtually all men by 1867 have the right to vote for British Parliament. More and more people are a part of the government, less and less feel the government is an enemy of theirs. I'm going to skip that. Skip that. All right. So you have France, that liberal principles are expanded in fits and starts with a lot of violence. You have Britain that recognizes if you want to avoid civil war, you have to give people rights slowly but surely. Otherwise, they're going to demand it by force because the ideas of the French Revolution are spreading too quickly. The clock cannot be turned back. Yeah.
I have a question. Were there like any indentured servants at this time?
The indentured servants were an American phenomenon, and by the 1800s, there was virtually none left because it was cheaper to simply buy slaves than to buy and control an indentured servant. Okay? So let's talk about the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Civil War is a perfect example of everyone believes in the same thing, liberalism, equality, free press, representative government, religious toleration. Everybody agrees on the same thing. But what happens about that one line that says liberalism is a government that also protects your property? It will respect your property rights. Everybody agrees to that as well. But it's problematic in a country like America where property is slavery. And liberalism is about equality of human beings. And that is contradictory to the other part of liberalism, which is respect for property. So how does America figure this out? I'll tell you how they figured it out. They didn't deal with it. In the Declaration of Independence, when southern states and northern states came together and said, we are the United States of America, the word slavery was never mentioned. Because if you mention slavery, it would erupt in debate and conversation, which would divide Northerners and Southerners, and you needed to keep them together to fight the war against Britain. You follow? Compromise. After the war is won and Americans spread westward, Congress has to decide, do we allow the expansion of slavery or do we not? In some places, like the Northwest Ordinances, slavery was abolished. You could not move to modern-day Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, which nowadays we call the Midwest. Back then it was called the Northwest. You couldn't legally bring slaves there. But you could legally bring slaves into what today is modern-day Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Arkansas, etc. Okay? Compromise. When the Constitution was drawn up in 1788, You needed to have Northerners and Southerners, pro-slavery and people that were not pro-slavery. They had to come together in a room in Philadelphia and agree that a new document was needed. A stronger national government was needed. The word slavery doesn't exist in our Constitution. The word slavery does not exist in our Constitution. The word slavery was introduced in our Constitution in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And it wasn't in the Constitution because if you bring up slavery directly, you're going to bring up the one thing that Americans violently disagree over. Partly because of moral reasons, and partly because there's a difference between the economies of the slave agricultural South and the non-slave industrial North. Different needs from the government. So how do you avoid it? You compromise. You don't mention slavery, but you also, there's a variety of things that happened at the Constitutional Convention. The most famous one was the 3/5 Compromise. Does anybody know about the 3/5 Compromise? Besides Zarisha, does anybody know? Emmanuel? Anyone else? Isaiah? Kind of? All right, so it kind of sounds familiar. We have two houses of Congress, right? We've got the House of Representatives and we got the Senate. In the Senate, each state, how many senators do they get? 2. In the House of Representatives, how many representatives does a state have? Depends on how many people live in the state. So New York State has more representatives than, say, Delaware, which is a much smaller state, right? Well, when you say proportion of the population, is that everybody living there, or is it free voting members of the population? How is that counted?
I think it's as many people who can vote. That makes sense.
Well, at the time, it was just everyone who lives in the state, right? Even though only some of them had the right to vote, white men. The problem was, however, that in determining how you fill the House of Representatives, Southerners said, we want to count our entire population, even the half that's enslaved. Northerners said, you can't have it both ways. You can't demand that a constitution protects the property rights of all Americans and slavery is property, which we're not going to disagree with, but then turn around and say slaves are people and should be counted as people for the purposes of representation in government. So which one is it? Are slaves property or are slaves people? Well, that was the logical response, but the Southerners said, you either give us something or we don't sign the Constitution, and then you have nothing. So they split the difference. Northerners said you can't count the slaves. Southerners says we're counting them like everybody else. So they split the difference. Southerners got to count the slaves as 3/5, each slave as 3/5 of a person. Okay? It's immoral, but it was strategic. You got to get these people on board to sign this paper because the Constitution was needed to strengthen the national government, which at that time was broke and powerless. Compromise, compromise, compromise. But then things started happening in the early 1800s. Americans started pushing further and further west. And every time they settled in a new territory, the settlers would come together, they would form a government, and they would petition to Congress, which is now located in Washington, D.C., for permission to enter the United States of America. So they would go from being a territory to an actual state, with representation in the Senate, the House of Representatives, and being able to vote for the president. So Congress gets this petition, they look at it, and they have to make a decision. Do they allow this state to come into the Union as a free state or as a slave-holding state? Now it gets dicey. Because remember, in the Senate, every state has got 2 senators. And there's a political balance between North and South. As the Americans move west, if you add a state that is slave-holding, there are more slave-holding senators in the Senate. there's a political imbalance. So now Northerners are not going to vote for it. So there's paralysis. You need to compromise. In 1820, the territory of Missouri requests permission to enter the United States of America as a slave-holding state. Northerners say no. But Missouri's got to come in. There's too many people living there that are obviously Americans. So a compromise is figured out in Congress. The state of Maine, which I'll show you, the state of Maine, which is way up here, used to be part of the state of Massachusetts. It was separated, made an independent state, not slaveholding, to balance the inclusion of Missouri as a slaveholding state. The political balance between North and South is preserved. Peace is maintained. The country remains united. You follow me so far? All right. Let me just pass ahead. Things get nutty in the Mexican War of 1846 and 48 because at this point, America gets a chunk of new territory. And so now the question of, as Americans spread westward and they make new states, will they be free or slave? These questions come up over and over and over again, and there's no more compromises left. And the more compromises that are attempted, the more people are bothered. And the more they start realizing that maybe the difference between North and South is so bad that the country shouldn't be united, that this slavery thing is actually unsolvable. So, in 1846, the United States goes to war with Mexico. They beat Mexico. In return for that victory, they acquire what today is the state of Texas, the entire Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah. They take the entire state of California, so a huge chunk of land. The American territorial landmass virtually doubles in this 2-year war. The question of where is slavery allowed to expand keeps coming up over and over in the Congress. In 1850, California petitions to come in as a state in the United States of America. It wants to come as a free state. Southerners say no. That'll upset the balance. So a compromise is worked out. But unlike the previous compromises, this one makes more people unhappy than happy. For instance, there is a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution that is now being enforced. Let me go back a little bit. In the U.S. Constitution, Article 4, it says there, without mentioning the word slavery, but it says there, if anyone is held to a term of labor, it doesn't say slavery, but if anybody is held to a term of labor and escapes from the person to whom they owe their labor, when that person is caught, they must be returned to the person they owe their labor to. This is just a fancy way of saying, if you are a slave and you escape the slave-holding South to the North, you are still technically a slave and you must be returned. You follow? But in the Constitution, there is no mechanism for seeking out, arresting these escaped slaves in the North and bringing them back to the South. There's no enforcement. Technically, if you're a slave from Arkansas and you escape to Illinois, which doesn't have slavery, the government of Illinois is supposed to capture you and send you back. If they don't, who else is going to do it? If the slave master comes into Illinois and says, that's my slave, I'm bringing him back home, he'll be arrested for kidnapping a free individual off the street. So Southerners have been pissed off about this for years, that the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution is law, but no one's obeying it. In the Compromise of 1850, a national police force is created, federal marshals, that now have the power to go anywhere in the country and arrest fugitive slaves. Why is that a problem? These people that are arrested on suspicion of being slaves, they don't get a day in court. They are arrested on the accusation of someone else, and then they're brought south. A lot of free blacks were arrested because of this. So even people that were racist and hated slaves and didn't care about slaves, they looked at this and they said, what happened to due process? Why are we throwing out civil liberties just to satisfy the South? So you have these divisions. These compromises are no longer working. Americans keep moving west, keep moving west. Now they push into what today is known as Kansas and Nebraska, in the middle of the country. Now, in Nebraska, nobody was going to bring any slaves. It was too far north, and the land was not amenable to slave plantation-based crops. Kansas, on the other hand, further south, slaveholders were moving into Kansas territory. And in 1854, they petitioned to enter as a slave state. But here's the problem. The Missouri Compromise, it tried to avoid these disagreements in the future by saying, as Americans move west, there's going to be a line. North of that line, no slavery is allowed. South of that line, Americans can do whatever they want. Kansas was north of that line. So Congress could say, well, the law says you can't have slaves there, but there was already a bunch of slaves in Kansas. And Congress needed Kansas to be admitted as a slave, to be admitted as a state, because they wanted to start building a railroad across America. It had to go through Kansas and Nebraska territory. So they compromised. What did they do? They got rid of the Missouri Compromise, which limited where you could bring slaves out west. And it said to the people of Kansas, you people decide if you want to be a slave state or a free state. This further upset the North, because the one law that limited the expansion of slavery was thrown out. And this is what I'm talking about. The original 13 colonies, these are the northern non-slave-holding states. These are the southern slave-holding states. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Kansas wants to come in as a slave state. Congress says, you people decide. This is Nebraska territory, California, etc. In 1850, yeah. The Missouri, yes. No. The Missouri Compromise is 1820. The Compromise of 1850 brought in California. It was rescinded, the Missouri Compromise, in 1854.
So even though part of California was below that line because of the compromises that they made? Like,
that's a good question. I didn't want to be too specific to be confusing, but you bring up a good question, so let me answer it. The Missouri Compromise said, if you draw a line from the southern border of Missouri and you bring it across, below it is slave state territory, north of it is not. But that line did not include the territory taken from Mexico. Okay? It only included all this middle territory that the Americans already had. In 1857, something else happens. A slave by the name of Dred Scott, who had been working in the North as an assistant to a doctor, sued for his freedom. He made the argument that he'd been living in the North in Illinois, as well as what later became Wisconsin, in territory that didn't recognize slavery, so he was now free. He went to court, and the Supreme Court unilaterally said, once a slave, always a slave. And as part of that decision, the Supreme Court also said, Congress does not have the right to limit the expansion of slavery. It doesn't have the constitutional right. This further alienated the North. Now the Supreme Court is siding with the slave-holding South. 2 years later, John Brown, an abolitionist, a hater of slavery, demanded the immediate abolition of slavery by violence, if need be. He armed a bunch of slaves in 1859, and he tried to seize Harper's Ferry, an Army weapons base or arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was captured, put on trial, and executed. The response to his execution was pronounced. Northerners felt that John Brown was the only guy that had the courage to stand up to the South and finally put an end to the slaveholders' control of American politics. Southerners were shocked that Northerners would be so supportive of a guy that put guns in the hands of slaves to execute white people as part of a slave uprising. And then Lincoln got elected in 1860. Lincoln was a member of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was not anti-slave. It wasn't for the abolition of slavery. But the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln campaigned on the promise that where slavery exists today, it will be protected as per the laws of America. But we will not allow it to expand anywhere else. This was the compromise that allowed the Republican Party to pretty much satisfy everybody in the North. Lincoln won the election of 1860. The South responded and seceded. They broke away from the country. They said, we've had it with these people who always want to interfere with slavery. And so the Civil War, the American Civil War between North and South over this issue of slavery. The North eventually wins. But my point is, with slavery in this country, this commitment to slavery as property, rooted in this liberal idea of equality and government respects property, it could only be abolished through a civil war. After years of compromise, this entire country was based on the principle of compromise with the issue of slavery, and it only was resolved through violence and the deaths of over 500,000 Americans. More deaths in that one war than all of the other wars America has fought in combined. That's how deeply entrenched slavery was in this country. Okay? So, I'll see you on, what, next Wednesday, right? And I'll have your revised papers by then. Enjoy your week off from me and from, I'm assuming, classes. Dinesh?